Okay, lesson 11. Um, no new lesson notes, so let's go right into the examples. Han and Priya are studying the size of trees in the forest next to their school. They each take a random sample to find the proportion of trees that have a trunk circumference greater than 4 feet. Tyler's sample contains 12 trees, and Priya's sample contains 20 trees. After collecting data, they run 100 simulations each to determine an estimate for the proportion of trees with large trunk circumferences. How do you think Tyler's reported margin of error compares to Priya's? And explain your reasoning. Okay. This goes back again to our notes from lesson 9. Okay. It has to do with sample size. If you increase the sample size, then you decrease the margin of error. If you decrease the sample size, then you increase the margin of error. So going back to our thing here, who has the larger sample size? So Tyler's sample had 12. Priya had a sample size of 20. So Priya's sample size is larger than Tyler's. So because her sample size is larger, that means the margin of error will be less. So the margin of error will be less. Therefore, the margin of error will be less. Okay. And that was all they were going for. Okay. The bigger the sample size, the smaller the margin of error is. Okay. Two reporters are both interested in finding the proportion of people in town who are unemployed. They each collect a random sample and use the proportion of unemployed people in the sample to run 100 simulations to determine a margin of error. The first reporter claims the proportion of unemployed people in town is 0.045 with a margin of error of 0.011. The second reporter claims the proportion of unemployed people in town is 0.037 with a margin of error of 0.02. Why do you think the estimated proportion of unemployed people in town is different for the two reporters? Well, the answer is quite simple. Okay. There are two different people. They collected two different samples. We know there's going to be some sort of variability in the results. Okay. So it's no wonder their estimates are different. If I collected my own sample and you each collected your own samples, okay, the data is not going to be exactly the same. Okay. So and I don't have enough room to write it down here, so I'm just going to give you the answer verbally. Okay, the reason the proportion of unemployed people in town is different for the two reporters, it has to do with variability in the data. Each reporter collected their own sample, which has different data. So therefore their proportions are going to be different. So that's the answer to A. Why do you think the margin of error is different for the two reporters? Okay, so the one reporter had a margin of error of 0.011, and the other reporter had a margin of error of 0.02. So this one was higher. The 0.02 is higher than 0.011. It could have to do with, going back to the last question, it could have to do with sample size. Okay. Less margin of error means increased sample size. If you increase the sample size, you decrease the margin of error. So this first reporter here, could have had a larger sample size than the second reporter, which would have caused a lesser margin of error. Okay, so why do you think the margin of error is different for the two reporters? Again, I'm going to give you the answer verbally. Why do we think the margin of error is different for the two reporters? The first reporter may have had a larger sample size, which would cause a lesser margin of error. Okay? And that is it for lesson 11.